As the dust settles on Labor's 10th budget, it's becoming clear just how extensive the broken promises, cuts to services really are. And the fact that what this budget tells Victorians is there's, under this government, no way out of the mess. Premier Jacinta Allan and Tim Pallas had an opportunity yesterday to provide a pathway out of the massive debt, the massive interest, the increasing taxes, the cuts to services. They had a chance to show us the way out of the mess their government created. Yet there's no light at the end of that tunnel. All we see are mounting debt that will approach $200 billion within 3 to 4 years. Interest will approach $10 billion a year, which will overshadow areas like housing, where we see more people needing a roof over their head, but we'll be spending more on interest thanks to the Allan Labor government. We see commitments to schools, commitments to childcare, commitments to hospital projects, all canned or put on the never never simply because Labor can't manage money and it hasn't been able to use this budget to prioritise the needs of the Victorian people. Sadly, this 10th Labor budget, which should have been an opportunity for Premier Jacinta Allan to detail a plan out of the mess that Labor has created, instead is telling Victorians we're going deeper into the black hole of debt, higher interest and higher taxes, with no real relief for anybody, not Victorian households, not Victorian businesses. To the extent that the government talks about cost of living relief, as we've seen, that's nothing but a mirage. All of the cost of living pressures on Victorians will continue to mount. I'll hand over to Brad and Jess.
Thanks, JP. Yesterday's budget spelt the 54th and 55th new or increased tax under this government over the last 10 years. That means at the moment there's something like $5,800 on the head of every Victorian in terms of Labor's taxes. Now, I've heard what the Premier and what the Treasurer have been saying since they delivered their budget about 24 hours ago today, and they just don't get it. They actually don't understand the impact of their decision making over the last 10 years on the lives of Victorians. Victorians know that they're being punished by Labor. Victorians know the impact of Labor taxes on their lives at the same time as Victorian household budgets are being stretched in every which way. But Labor just don't get it. Everything that they have said indicates that they don't get it. After 10 years of Labor, after 10 Labor budgets, they are so far removed from the reality of communities and the reality of kitchen tables right around this state, and the reality that singles, that families and that older Victorians face to try and make ends meet. That is where their focus should have been in their budget. That's where their focus wasn't in this budget. Their focus was on higher taxes, greater debt, greater interest payments, and a greater burden on generations of Victorians still to be born. That will be Labor's legacy. That will be Treasurer Tim Pallas's legacy after 10 Labor budgets. Jess.
Thanks very much, Brad. And Victorians are waking up today after Labor's 10th budget, which is a culmination of 10 years of financial mismanagement in this state. And that has consequences. Debt has consequences. On the eve of the 2022 election, then Premier Daniel Andrews said Victorians could have it all. They could have education spending, they could have new hospitals, and they could have new rail services like the suburban rail loop. Well, this budget shows that that just isn't possible. We've got today families waking up across Victoria asking, will their children, will students in Victorian schools be better off under the Allan Labor government? And the answer is simply no. We have a situation where 29 projects, 29 school upgrades that were promised at the state election have been unfunded in this budget. An example of Broadford Primary School, $13.9 million to desperately upgrade those facilities in an area where there's significant population growth. Children in those classrooms do not have the facilities they need to have the learning outcomes that they need for the future. And that's because this government has mismanaged the budget. We have rising debt levels, we have interest bills that will, in a day, outweigh school upgrade election commitments, and that is simply unacceptable for Victorian families and for Victorian students who at the end of the day will be passed on this intergenerational debt and be paying this burden for years to come.
Can I just ask about the school upgrades? The Premier was asked about that this morning on radio and she said, no, they're all absolutely going ahead, that it's been misreported. What do you say to that?
Well, I say, why weren't they funded in this budget? The government now has had 2 budgets to fully fund the $850 million of election commitments across the state of Victoria. These election commitments, these school upgrades were made on the eve of the election, promised to Victorians, promised to Victorian families, and yet there are 29 in the budget that do not have funding. Now, if these are going to be delivered before the 2026 election, they need to be starting construction now. Look at any government project and look at the time delay that has cost. Look at right across the board, around an average of 25% blowout in time delays to any government project. The school upgrades are no different. So if they're not funded in this project, there's no funding for planning and design purposes, then they're waiting until the next budget, and then we're only a year or so out from the next election. I don't see how they can possibly be delivered. This is a broken promise by the Allen government, and if you look, unfortunately, where the funding goes to, it disproportionately is going to Labor electorates.
There's a lot of broken promises in this budget, particularly, we had Daniel Andrews stand up saying there's going to be the biggest hospital redevelopment the country's seen. Can we trust the government? Can we trust what they're saying?
We continue to see a pattern of the Allen Labor government making promises and then just walking away from those promises when the truth catches up with them. We saw it over the Commonwealth Games. We've seen it yesterday in the budget around the Arden Health Precinct project, a $5 billion project that can't proceed where they said it would proceed. Just think of all of the costs that are wasted because they made that announcement and didn't do basic due diligence. Same with the Commonwealth Games. We're seeing with major projects as well. They make promises and then they walk away from them. And who pays the price? Victorians. I would hate to know what the total cost of those broken promises is when you add up all of the work that's done and that is then wasted when the government says, no, it turns out to be too expensive for what we said it would cost and we're not going to proceed. In the end, they don't care because Labor knows it's not their money, but it's Victorian households and businesses who pick up the tab. And it's not fair on them and it's not right. And it's not the leadership our state needs. And I do say, as Alternative Premier, we've already made announcements that will reform and improve the way we bring major projects to market and then deliver those major projects to make sure they represent the best deal for Victorians and Victorian taxpayers, to make sure that those who build these projects shoulder the risk and to make sure that there are not blowouts and that these projects are delivered on time. Because we also know that in addition to the financial impact of these major projects, there's delays that deprive other sectors of the economy, like residential construction, of the workforce and materials they need to deliver the housing our state needs. It's time that the Allen Labor government understands you can't just make promises casually without doing the proper due diligence when there's a risk, as we've seen, that at the end of the day, the truth catches up with you, you can't afford it, you waste so many tens of millions of dollars, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars like the Commonwealth Games, and then walk away from those projects.
I don't know if you heard the Treasurer on 3AW this morning. He was asked specifically about the suburban rail work and why they're continuing with that project, and he pointed to the seats that travel along that line. Do you think that's the first admission we've seen that this is pure politics to keep that project going?
Tim Pallas revealed the ultimate truth around the suburban rail loop. It was never a project that stacked up. It didn't have any proper supporters. What we heard from Tim Pallas this morning was the truth. It was all political. It was just done to shore up Labor seats along the suburban rail tunnel line. That's all it was. It was a cheap political stunt for them, but a massively expensive stunt for the rest of the state and future generations that will wear the burden of hundreds of billions of dollars in debt for a project no one ever asked for. Labor adopted this project and has pushed it all along for political reasons, and we know that because Tim Pallas this morning admitted it and told us so.
We hear a lot about how much debt Victoria will go into. Should Labor start spending more?
Labor should have reformed the infrastructure projects currently on the books. We've got around $200 billion of projects, and there's nothing in the budget that tells us that they will start to rein in those cost blowouts. There's nothing in the budget that comes anywhere close to being a debt reduction plan that the Auditor General cited the need for some months ago. Labor's never planned to get us out of this mess. Will approach $200 billion in the next 3 to 4 years. And that's going to impose unbearable burdens on many Victorian households and businesses around our state that are already struggling.
I think it was maybe Friday or Monday when you were talking about the lapsing programs. Is there any there that haven't been funded you're concerned about?
We'll come back to you on that. We're working our way through the detailed programs. We might come back to you on that.
There's $2.5 billion from tax dividends, particularly around the Redrose and PAC. Could that be better spent?
This is an example of how the Allan Labor government puts its political interests before the interests of the Victorian people. Think about it. The Transport Accident Commission is there. Its chief responsibility is to promote road safety. This year we've lost around just short of 100 lives so far on our roads, tragically. Yet the Allan Labor government is going to rip $2.5 billion out of the Transport Accident Commission simply to shore up its own budget, which would otherwise be deeply in the red. And so what it's doing is putting its own political interests ahead of road safety. The Transport Accident Commission should either be reinvesting those proceeds into road safety or returning that money to Victorian taxpayers and motorists in the form of lower rego fees and other road charges. Thank you very much. Anything for Jess or Brad? All good. Thanks.
Thank you so much.